Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Devil's Advocate podcast. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome American journalist Chris Horton, who is based in Taipei. He's an author of the book A Ghost Nation, about the history of Taiwan and its struggle for freedom and democracy, especially in the modern era. So thank you for joining us, Chris.
Hi, Han. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I've read your book. It's a fascinating account of the modern history of Taiwan. Tell us about the title. What does it capture about Taiwan's status in the world?
Well, Ghost Nation. There's a few different ways in which it relates to the book and to Taiwan's story, but basically, Taiwan is it's a near G20 economy. It produces technology that everyone uses. Every major country has some sort of relationship with Taiwan, but it's not in the United Nations. Only a handful of countries officially recognize Taiwan's government, and so it's kind of on the fringe of international society, of the international community in many ways, and it can't because of China's claim on Taiwan and the sway that China has over both the United Nations and also United Nations member states. It's kind of a situation where there's pretty much zero chance of Taiwan becoming a full-fledged part of the international community anytime soon. So, in a way, it's a ghost to the world, but also it's kind of been ghosted by fellow democracies and other countries. Not even non-democratic nations need Taiwan for different things, and have prospered and benefited from Taiwan's sovereignty. So this isn't just aimed at democracies, but yeah, Taiwan occupies a place in the world that basically no other countries really experienced that in the post World War II era.
Tell us, how did you come to write the book? And you spent a few years in mainland China and also Hong Kong, and you studied Mandarin. So tell us your brief history of your personal history, how your personal journey.
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't really interested in Taiwan until fairly recently. It was China that I was very interested in, and in the late 1990s, I started studying Mandarin Chinese at the University of Kansas, and I ended up going over to China for the first time in 1998 with the Princeton and Beijing program, doing an intensive language course there. And that was my first time living in a city and being outside of the U.S. And as a young man from Kansas, it was pretty eye-opening. I was really taken by late 90s, the energy that it was basically right when the economy was about to be unleashed. Private property was about to become legal. People were going to start owning homes, and you could just feel that there was something very big was about to happen.
I ended up moving. Which university were you at in Beijing?
I was at Beijing Normal University.
Yeah.
So in Jishuitan, it was a good time. And then so I ended up graduating with a degree, just a bachelor's degree in Chinese language and culture in 2000, and then went to China initially to study on a scholarship in Henan, in Zhengzhou, at Zhengzhou University. And then basically the air pollution in Zhengzhou was so bad that I ended up dropping out of. I quit the scholarship halfway through and moved to Shanghai, and then really kind of started to take interest in China's economic rise and just how that was changing the lives of Chinese people, but also changing the world. And after 3 years in Shanghai, I ended up moving to Yunnan in I stayed in Kunming most of the time there, and was there for almost 9 years.
That's probably the best climate in China.
It's if you're into cool, warm sunshine and cool breezes, it's pretty nice. Yeah, and it's amazing food. The people, everywhere in China has, it's so big. There's so many different kind of local cultures and personalities. And Yunnan people are, I think they're some of the most fun and just easy to hang out with people I've met in my life, not just in China. Yunnan was a great time. And after almost 9 years there, so I was doing freelance journalism there, and I had my own blog that I kind of monetized, and that was like an income stream when I was there. Then I moved to, I sold the blog, and I moved to Hong Kong. That was in 2013. So that was basically right when Xi Jinping took over in Beijing, and I thought Hong Kong would be a pretty boring, kind of quiet few years, and it turned out I moved there right before the umbrella movement took place, which so that was in 2014, and I remember seeing some video of the sunflower movement in Taiwan, which was just a few months earlier, and being impressed by the bravery of the nonviolent peaceful protesters in Taiwan, just as I was by the protesters, the umbrella protesters in Hong Kong. And when I realized, after the Hong Kong government dismantled all the camps without any concessions or compromise with the peaceful protesters, I kind of thought, well, Taiwan or Hong Kong, maybe the future is not looking so good. Also, it was a very expensive place to be a freelance journalist, so I didn't want to go back to China, didn't want to go back to the U.S., and I had never been to Taiwan, so I came over here, and I found it refreshingly different, and I decided basically within an hour of being in Taipei that I would give it a try, and so I moved here, 2015, so it's been 11 years now. I wasn't expecting to be here this long, but I remember when I got here, I really wanted like a book, kind of a go-to book in English that would just explain Taiwan to me. And there are some good academic books, and then there's some good general audience books like Green Island, a historical novel by Shauna Yang Ryan, and Formosa Betrayed by the former U.S. diplomat George Kerr. But both of those, George Kerr's book was was kind of centered around the transition from Taiwan being a Japanese territory to a Chinese territory in the mid 40s, and then Green Island, a great novel, and it really explains so much. But the story ends in 2003, so there was still kind of a lot more that had happened since then. So I kind of thought it would be great if there were kind of a general audience book that would kind of cover up to the modern day, to tell Taiwan's story and kind of put everything in context, but like not overload the reader. And after a few years, I realized that if I wanted to see that book, I basically needed to do it myself. And there's a lot of great books that have come out about Taiwan recently, and I'm just honored to have my book be part of this really impressive cohort.
Going back to the book title, so you argue Taiwan has been ghosted by the international community. So who is most responsible for that, and why?
Well, I mean that's a difficult question to answer. I think there's lots of different parties. I wouldn't say it's the Taiwan people's fault per se, but Chiang Kai-shek was the one who pulled the Republic of China out of the United Nations in 1971, leading to the vote, the Armenia-sponsored vote, UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, that kicked out the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the UN. It doesn't mention the word Taiwan at all. So Taiwan's status in the UN is not, it still remains undetermined. But also Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, they were also very keen to kind of get rid of the relationship with the Republic of China in Taiwan in order to establish relations with Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China in Beijing. And this was during the Sino-Soviet split, and Kissinger and Nixon really wanted to kind of take advantage of that split and kind of double team the Soviet Union with China. And indeed, one of the first things, eventually, Watergate actually ended up derailing those plans to, in the early 70s, to recognize the People's Republic of China. But Jimmy Carter in 1979, January 1st, 1979, changed recognition. And almost immediately, the CIA set up a listening booth, listening station in Xinjiang, which it was obviously agreed upon by both sides. It was built by the CIA, and it was manned by Chinese staff. So that began an interesting new era of kind of intelligence sharing and cooperation in that kind of spirit. sphere between the U.S. and China.
So if Taiwan's ambiguity in its status, as you said, is a ghost nation, how is that status sustainable, or is it inherently unstable?
Well, I mean, I guess any country's status is never fully permanent. There's everything. There's rising and falling. I mean, in terms of the if you just look at the actual states themselves, the governments themselves, the ROC has so far outlasted the PRC. The PRC looks a bit bigger and stronger in many ways, but as the breakup of the Soviet Union showed, no one really saw that coming, and it just kind of happened. And I'm not saying that's going to happen to China or to the ROC. It could happen anywhere, and states that normally projected a degree of stability that was taken for granted, like the U.S., now look less stable than before. So we're entering an interesting time, and this is the ROC government has survived a lot of twists and turns, including having to basically relocate from China to Taiwan in the late 40s, and so I wouldn't count it out. But obviously, this is not the ideal situation for any state to find itself in.
In your book, you mentioned the article written by the Chinese ambassador to Australia, Mr. Xiao Qian.
Yes.
He basically, I think that was the standard test the Chinese government used to promote its own idea about why Taiwan should be part of China. Maybe I'll give you an opportunity now to elaborate on the 7-point, your rebuttal to the 7-point raised by Mr. Xiao, which is basically what the Chinese government has always been claiming about why it treats Taiwan as part of China. Okay, so the first point, Mr. Xiao said Taiwan has been, well, this is the most important and most repeated claim by the Chinese government, that Taiwan
Right.
has always been an inalienable part of China since ancient times.
Right.
And so how do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, there's if you look at the actual history in terms of Taiwan's, who's ruled Taiwan, you've only had Taiwan being controlled for 4 years by a Chinese government in China on the other side of the strait from Taiwan, and that was 1945 to 1949. Calling the indigenous Taiwanese people Chinese it's pretty laughable. And also, even the Chinese Communist Party, it talks about how China has 5,000. Now it's starting to hear 6,000, but still like 6,000 years of history. And, we're talking, the ambassador is talking about migration from, 30,000 years ago. That's multiples of the history, that the Chinese government claims for China itself. So there was no China. There were no countries 30,000 years ago. I mean, we all came from Africa. Although the Chinese Communist Party does have its theories about Chinese people having separate, evolutionary history, which I find kind of also amusing. But yeah, it's in terms of references to Taiwan, I wasn't able to find anything until the earliest verified account of Taiwan was the Dongfanji by a man named Chen Di, who was like a scholar and I think an advisor to the Ming Dynasty. But he went over. There were the Ming Dynasty had some in the late Ming. There were some problems with pirates that were based on the Taiwanese west coast, and he went over with a Chinese general, a Ming general, came over to Taiwan, and he only wrote about 1,000 characters about in this Dongfanji. But it's interesting, he didn't call it Taiwan, he called it Dongfan, Dongfan, which is like Eastern barbarians, right? So this is not like like you're talking about family or anything like that. There's no tone of that. It's all very much kind of exoticized, and like looking at the local Taiwanese indigenous inhabitants through very foreign eyes. So I don't in terms of the three kingdoms, I mean, let's see, all the imperial central governments of China all set up administrative bodies to exercise jurisdiction over Penghu and Taiwan. This is just blatantly false. I mean, there have been so many different dynasties in Chinese history, and many of them very far to the north with no navies whatsoever, so they wouldn't even be able to get to Taiwan. But also there's just no archaeological proof of anyone arriving prior to the very end of the Ming Dynasty.
But the Qing government did set up Taiwan as a province, and the Beijing would argue that the Republic of China took over the sovereignty from Qing, and then the People's Republic of China, run by the Communist Party, took over Chinese sovereignty from the Republic of China. So it would claim that that's a line of succession in terms of inheriting the sovereignty over Taiwan. How do you respond to that?
I mean, that's a claim that they can make, but it's a pretty shaky one. First of all, the Qing, I mean, depending on the situation, as you know, the Qing dynasty, it's either a foreign dynasty, along with the Yuan dynasty, or, in other contexts, it becomes a Chinese dynasty. The Manchu people, they have a very different culture from the Han people. And, and also the Qing did not really control Taiwan. They outsourced most of the governance to Taiwanese gentry, but they only controlled the coastal plain, and that's only like roughly 1/3 of Taiwan's area. The remaining 2/3 was all mountainous and inhabited by indigenous people who were never subjugated by the Qing. And so when the first Japanese governor general came over to Taiwan in 1895, he didn't really have any administrative buildings that he could take from the Qing. He ended up initially starting off in Geelong in a Western-built kind of customs house. That was the most appropriate accommodation he could find for the new colonial Japanese government. And then that led to him eventually moving to Taipei and constructing an entirely new kind of government area, the Boai Tochu, which still exists today, because there was nothing really to be handed over by the Qing to the Japanese. And the Japanese era it's 50 years in which Taiwan was the average Taiwanese person went from being an illiterate peasant in 1895 to in 1945 being compared to the rest of Asia enjoying higher levels of education, better healthcare, rule of law than pretty much anywhere else in Asia. And while I think in China and Korea there's kind of a confusion as to why Taiwanese people would look at Japanese with kind of like a different a less angry or upset kind of tone. One thing that happened in Taiwan or in China and Korea, there were already countries, right? And they were overtaken. They were overthrown by the Japanese. Whereas Taiwan wasn't a country at this point. It was you had loose Qing rule on 1/3 of it, and then basically indigenous Taiwanese doing their own thing, more or less unmolested by the Qing. So, this was not really a country that was overthrown. So, and also the Japanese did commit a lot of horrible acts, both in the taming of the western portion of Taiwan, as well as the mountains, but especially the mountains. It took about 4 months to take the coastal plain, and it took more than 2 decades to subdue the indigenous people in the mountainous regions in the central and eastern part of the island. And there were separate wars that were required to unify Taiwan under one administration. But it was the Japanese that really made Taiwan an administrative unit. It wasn't the Qing. And the ROC came over here. While they were initially welcomed by the Taiwanese, they quickly wore out their welcome because of corruption and kind of seizing of property. Monopolies from that the Japanese had set up were just transferred over to the ROC. So it remained kind of an extractive endeavor. And the 228 rebellion in in 1947, just less than 2 years after the arrival of the KMT and the ROC, the KMT party state. It highlights that basically in the eyes of Taiwanese people, the ROC did not have legitimacy anymore.
As you mentioned, the colonial history by Japan over 50 years in Taiwan, is it part of the reason why President Lai the other day, I think last month, quite controversially in his speech said that the ROC's crime committed in Taiwan is worse than the Japanese colonial authorities' crime, and that caused quite some controversy among the pro-Beijing social media circle, I guess, because for people, including myself, who are brought up in the Chinese education system, we always treated the Japanese colonial rule as the biggest single catastrophe, atrocity committed against the Chinese nation. And for Lai to say that the ROC is worse than the Japanese ruler, it's quite uncomfortable for many mainland Chinese to hear. So I guess, as you mentioned, there's unique colonial history where the Japan, when they committed many crimes, but also they built up the infrastructure and implemented education for the general public in Taiwan. So that's probably explained why Lai's attitude, which represent a lot of the Taiwanese people's ambivalence towards Japan, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think I mean it is very complicated. There's a lot of nuance in this whole kind of discussion, but it's Taiwan had a very different experience with Japan than China did. They were both invaded by Japan, but Taiwan was Japan's first colony, and it wanted to create a showcase colony because it had plans to colonize much of the rest of East and Southeast Asia. And so by making things nicer materially for Taiwanese people, that was one way of selling, kind of like, let's all become one, co-prosperity sphere, as they termed it, with Japan at the top, the benevolent ruler or whatever, benevolent dictator. But in China, the experience of Chinese people was very different from the Taiwanese with regards to Japan. But in China, what the ROC did in China, led to it was very corrupt. It was hated by many Chinese people, and that was part of what fueled the communist revolution. And then here in Taiwan, while the Japanese had done many awful things during their colonization, especially at the beginning when they were establishing their control over Taiwan, they didn't quite do anything at the same level as what the KMT did during the March massacres of 1947, in which, according to ROC government estimates, 28,000 people in about a 3-week period were murdered by the KMT, and it was very much focused on taking out the political and educational elites of Taiwan, so that they wouldn't have that generation of potential leaders to lead an independent Taiwanese state. And so, it's Taiwanese, so Lai, he comes from, those, that part of the Taiwanese spectrum, identity spectrum, so there's also people that came over from China, Chinese people that came over, and now they're ROC nationals who may or may not identify as Taiwanese, or some mix of Taiwanese and Chinese. But so in Taiwan, they're kind of grouped in 2 different groups. One is Bunshengren, so that's the people who are of Chinese descent, but their families predate the migrations of the 40s, and then the Waishengren, who are the people whose families came over in the mid to late 40s, and or even like 1950. And so for the Bunshengren, for the native Taiwanese, they what they experienced under KMT martial law, following the trauma of 228 in 1947. They had 38 years of martial law, and a Chinese identity was forced upon them. So for them, it was indeed quite traumatic, and I would say more traumatic than what they experienced under Japan. And that's not to diminish, the awful things that Japan did at various different times when they were in Taiwan. Especially, if you look at like some of the massacres of indigenous people on the East Coast, the Musha, following them, like the Musha incident, and some other uprisings as well. But overall, I mean, I would say, at least in the pre-democracy era, the Taiwanese experience under Japanese rule was less harsh than what it experienced, especially in the first few decades of ROC rule. And you can kind of see a bit of an analogy in terms of Hong Kongers and the British Empire. It's like while they may not have enjoyed being colonized, they came into the modern era and industrialized and kind of matured as an economy and as a society under British rule, and then experienced very big changes under Chinese rule. And while they're not exactly the same, there are some parallels.
I guess you can make an analogy with, say, Shanghai, because Shanghai was also a colony in last century in the early part, and that's part of the reason why Shanghai is the most advanced city in China right now, because of its colonial history, the way the education and culture were brought from the West, and to this day, I think the Shanghainese people still look upon other provincial people as inferior because of their probably they don't want to say it, but everybody understands that because of their colonial history, and they think they are more superior than the rest of the Chinese. I think that's a comparable.
I lived for 3 years in Shanghai, and I wouldn't say everyone there thinks that way, but I definitely met people who do. And it's I mean, it was the most international city of China, and it was definitely singled out for special treatment after the Communist Revolution, and it wasn't really allowed to flourish until it was time to until Zhongnanhai decided it was time to be capitalist, and then it was like, okay, well, let's unleash Shanghai again and look at it today. Yeah, it's at a natural position to serve that function.
Let's going back to Ambassador Xiaoqian's argument. So the second point he raised is that the international community recognized Taiwan as part of China because, also mentioned in your book, the Cairo Declaration in 1943 and the Potsdam Proclamation in 1945, they both stipulated that Japan must return Taiwan, well, all the territory, including Taiwan, it had taken from China. So that's established the sort of the international world order after World War II, which means that Taiwan, by design, and the victors of the World War II ask that Taiwan be returned to the Chinese sovereignty.
Sure. Yeah. So at that time, Taiwan in 1943, Taiwan was still Japanese territory, and it had received Japan from the Qing through the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which obviously most treaties, especially back then, they weren't signed with both signatories having equal power. It was usually after a war or conflict, and the Qing also surrendered even more territory to the Russians 1 or 2 decades prior to the treaty with Japan. But it's in terms of the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation, both of these were statements of intent by the Allies, none of whom had any sort of control or sovereignty over Taiwan. But also, I think my understanding, and I've spoken to plenty of lawyers on this, is these declarations of intent are not legally binding according to international law, whereas the Sino-British treaty that gave Hong Kong to the PRC, that actually is, but international law and its importance and significance and relevance today is, that's probably another question as well.
All right. So the third point by Ambassador Qian is that the United Nations Resolution 2758, you mentioned before, the resolution itself can't be misinterpreted or challenged. That's his words. So in 1971, the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution and restored PRC's seat at UN, and affirming that the PRC government is the sole legal government representing the whole of China. So even though it didn't mention Taiwan, but the whole of China will implies all the territory, including Taiwan. Does it?
Well, my understanding would not. I mean, historically, Taiwan just wasn't really a part of China. I mean, like, are we talking? Also, there's this conflation of the Qing and the territories that it had, that it controlled to varying degrees, and historical China. I would say the Ming Dynasty was the last Han Chinese dynasty, and it was significantly smaller. This feels a bit more like opportunism in terms of, well, the Qing had it, so we can take it too. And while I can understand those urges, there's just nothing that China has. I mean, this is why you have to say things like, "Zigui Lai," since ancient times, because if you had like some sort of smoking gun, yes, this used to be ours, and now it's not. It would be different. Were we the Qing dynasty? I don't think China was the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty conquered China, and then it also conquered very loosely controlled a bit of Taiwan. And so if it's kind of like the British Empire, it conquered India, and then also it had Hong Kong. So after it gives up control of both, should Hong Kong be part of India? I mean, and there were a lot of Indian people in Hong Kong. So but in terms of like 1945, that was when the ROC itself, signed the UN Charter, and there was a big movement for self-determination of peoples. And in 1945, with no small help from American propaganda, the Taiwanese people were ready to be part of a new China. But as soon as that new China arrived with the KMT in 1945 on U.S. warships, they quickly began to have doubts about their future under the ROC and whether they wanted to be part of the ROC. Even then, there was still no, let's start our own country and call it Taiwan. It was just more of a hope that the U.S. or the UN would step in and at least take temporary stewardship over Taiwan so that they could figure something out. But that's not how things worked out. In terms of UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, there's no mention of Taiwan. And I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is, like, you don't imply things. You want to get things in writing, as clear as possible, so that there aren't any misunderstandings or arguments later down the line. And so there's nothing to suggest in that resolution that Taiwan belongs to the PRC.
The fourth point by Ambassador Chen is that Taiwan is the legacy of Chinese Civil War. This is the argument I'm personally most sympathetic to. For example, let's compare it to the American Civil War, right? The Union defeated the Confederate, and they become the legal government covering the whole of the United States. And for the Chinese Civil War, the communists defeated the nationalists, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan. And so this is basically the legacy of that unfinished civil war. And today, the mainland China that run by the communists, it's much larger, much more powerful in terms of the economic and military power. It has basically the capacity, the power to finish off the nationalists in a civil war, right? If they want to. So in that pure argument, purely on power and on this general idea on the civil war, isn't the communists entitled to finish off the Republic of China, Chinese government, the Republic of China government to unify the whole China, because that's what civil war is.
Well, I guess the question is, does being part of, a kind of, deteriorating Republic of China from 1945, to 1949, does that mean that, you're Chinese territory? I think for Taiwanese people, the answer has generally been no. It's people whose descendants came, who are Wai who are more sympathetic to this view of things, and understandably. But it was like maybe 1 to 2 million Chinese came over in the second half of the 40s, and there were already more than 6 million Taiwanese people here and had been here for many generations. So I think that's it's really one of those things where it's really, I mean, if this is kind of traveling more into the realm of emotion, but if you're talking about like a solid claim on Taiwan because of 4 years, halfway through those 4 years, of course, you have a violent uprising where the Taiwanese people overthrew the KMT basically for 1 week before they were later massacred. I mean, is that a very strong claim on Taiwan? I think a lot of people here don't see it that way, and I don't either. But when I came over from China 11 years ago, I had definitely heard this argument, and it does make sense from a if you brush aside the existence of Taiwanese people and their own unique history, and there's still more of them than there are people from Waishanren families, but there's also been a lot of intermarriage, and so there's loads of Taiwanese people who have one parent who's Waisheng and one who's Bunsheng, and maybe they don't talk politics at dinner, and maybe they do, but it's really like one of those arguments where historical claims, again, in modern international law, there's two kind of main things or main arguments around statehood. One is, historical claims really shouldn't, they don't matter, because it's really anything can be proven. I mean, much of the Northwest United States used to be Russia for longer than the ROC in China controlled Taiwan. So should northwestern US be Russia? I mean, it's there's so many different arguments that can be brought up, and this is precisely because humans have moved around so much, and there's been so much war, and territory gained and lost and regained and relost. But in 1945, the movement was like, all right, this is the world we've got. Let's stabilize it and make it peaceful. And I just don't see a very strong Chinese historical claim on Taiwan.
Well, let's imagine, so you're an American citizen. Let's imagine, say, the Confederates, after the defeat in the Civil War, they fled to Cuba. That's not far from the United States mainland, right? Similar distance, probably like Taiwan to China. If they fled to Cuba and they established the Confederate Republic there, and then isn't the Union entitled to pursue them onto the island to finish off them in the Civil War?
I don't really see. I mean, like if they're in Cuba and they're claiming to be the government of the U.S., I mean, I guess they would just be isolated, similarly to how Taiwan is. But I don't see how that gives how that would give the Union the right to invade Cuba.
Actually, let's talk about Cuba. Even though at the moment the Cuban people, they have their own sovereignty, their own country, and the United States for the last 50, 60 years still feel entitled to regime change Cuba. And at the moment, I think the Trump government is having embargo of oil embargo,
Sure.
and it's very cruel and very I think very unjustified, right? Whatever you think of the Cuban government, this system of government, they are a sovereign country, and the United States shouldn't have been trying this hard for the how many decades to try to overthrow this government and to keep the people starving or poor. And this is a total.
Sure. Well, this is a bit far from the discussion of,
well,
Taiwan,
I guess my point is
I'm also going to say that,
Mhm.
like, I'm not I mean, while I am an American national, I do what I consider my best to try to be as even-handed with my own government as I am with other governments in telling the story of Taiwan. And there's different Chinese governments have approached Taiwan with their interests in mind, and the U.S. has approached Taiwan with its own interests in mind. And we looked the other way when the KMT was massacring Taiwanese people. We gave them political cover, both during the massacres following 228 in 1947, but also during martial law. We called it Free China. I mean, I like, in terms of talking about other countries. First of all, I don't think it's super relevant to this discussion, and second of all, I don't know those countries very well. So I've never been to Cuba, so I think it's really not as useful. But I mean, I think in terms of Taiwan, I do have some experience having written about it, and I'd be happy to delve further into Ambassador Chiao's claims on Taiwan.
Yeah, all right. Let's go back to the fifth point by Ambassador Chen. Is the destiny of Taiwan lies in the will of all Chinese people. The Chinese government's point is that doesn't the 1.4 billion Chinese people has to have a say in the future of Taiwan as well?
Well, I mean, if you think that Taiwan is inherently part of China, then I guess so. But I just don't really see any historical proof of that fact. I mean, like, I don't want to keep going over the same thing I've said, but you've had only 4 years in all of human history where a Chinese government controlled all of Taiwan, and it was still not very tightly controlled. And and also it barely controlled China at the time. It was losing China to a communist insurrection. So in terms of, like, I just don't see where Taiwan fits into the PRC's territory. Just because it's claimed is one thing. Arunachal Pradesh, a state in India, which the Chinese government calls South Tibet, should do the Chinese people, do they get to decide the future of Arunachal Pradesh, even though it's never been under PRC rule, just like how Taiwan's never been under PRC rule? I just don't see it. I mean, this is just deciding that, okay, we have feelings about this place, so we're going to decide its future. What about the Taiwanese people? I mean, and this is the thing. It's always, the Taiwanese people are always erased from every discussion, and not just by Chinese. The U.S. often erases Taiwanese people, and it becomes, and then you have this kind of abstract Taiwan that we're talking about, where there's not 23.4 million people here. It's just this thing that's kind of being negotiated by two powers. And Taiwan, I would say it wasn't until its importance globally, through its production of the world's top end semiconductors. It wasn't until everybody realized that Taiwan was important for that Taiwan started to kind of get a seat at the table internationally, and people started engaging with Taiwan a bit more directly, rather than thinking of it as this U.S.-China thing.
All right. So point number 6, I think it's a little bit, I don't know what to say. It's a kind of literary reference with a poem expressing the sorrow. So I guess that's not much relevant here. Let's go to point 7, the last point. Okay, the last point, which is quite relevant, I guess, because most of not most, every Western country who has established diplomatic relations with China has, well, if not accepted, at least what I think, I'm not sure about the U.S. In the Australian version is that we acknowledge the position taken by Beijing, that the one China principle. And so that's all the Western countries has adopted this, at least on paper, that is one China. So the Chinese government will claim that under this principle, one China principle, Taiwan is, by definition, is part of China. This wouldn't be a separate China.
Sure. Well, going back to history, you have the Republic of China fleeing to Taiwan and then claiming to be the legitimate government of both Taiwan and China. And with democratization in the 1990s, the Republic of China government effectively gave up its claim and its intention to retake China, to Guangfu Dalu, as they say. And I would say, basically you have Taiwan as a country starting with democratization in the early 90s. And if there weren't the threat of war from China, as well as a lot of people here who would have fought against the change of the country's name from ROC to Taiwan, then maybe it might have happened back then. Now, because of the military situation, it's pretty, what is Taiwan independence? It's getting rid of the Republic of China and just creating a state called Taiwan, right? And so, it's important in that aspect. There are some countries, Western democracies such as Brazil and Spain, who recognize the Chinese claim, the PRC claim on Taiwan as its territory, but most only acknowledge it, which basically means like, look, I see that you claim that. I don't agree or disagree, but I see that you claim that. And that's where the U.S. and most other major Western countries are at the moment. But that by no means confers, any sort of recognition upon the PRC's claim on Taiwan.
In your book, you document the history of Taiwan, how Taiwan went from authoritarian rule under the Kuomintang to one of the Asia's the freest democracies. So, what's the central factor that made that transition possible, do you think?
Well, I would say there is no central factor. It was as history shows, unlikely things can happen. Look at the Chinese Communist Party. They were almost eliminated by the KMT, down in Jiangxi, and they did the Long March. You had the Long March up to the north, and I mean there are already people up there as well. But it really forged a communist party that was much tougher than the Kuomintang and the Republic of China, and I think that's a big contributor to how they won. But in terms of Taiwan, there's many different factors. One of them is there were more Taiwanese people. There were more Bunshengren than Weishengren, and with the Cold War, you didn't have Chinese people coming over. I mean, basically after 1950, you didn't really have Chinese people coming over to Taiwan from China anymore. And so that so in terms of like identity, there was still like this underlying, even if the gun was held by Chinese people, by Chinese hands, forcing Taiwan to adopt a Chinese identity. At home, people were Taiwanese. People spoke Taiwanese at home, or Hakka, or indigenous languages, even if they were speaking Mandarin outside, at school, at work. And there were people in the KMT that were sympathetic to that wanted a democracy, not necessarily a Taiwanese democracy, but they wanted the ROC to become democratic. And then you have people like Lee Teng-hui. He was a crucial, he was a pivotal person in that whole movement. Although without the movement prior to him becoming president, there wouldn't have been the chance for democratization. But there was derecognition of the ROC by the U.S. The ROC kind of becoming this ghost republic, or phantom republic, ghost nation, whatever you want to call it. That had a big impact. It really reduced the legitimacy of the ROC and the Chang dynasty. And when after Jiang Jingguo, Chiang Kai-shek's son and successor, after he passed in the 1980s, just late 1980s, after ending martial law, you had Lee Teng-hui, the first Taiwanese-born ROC president. He was KMT. But his heart, it was green. It was Taiwanese, and he as a KMT, president of the ROC, he responded to what became known as the Wild Lily protests by basically agreeing to the students' demands. This is just like months after Tiananmen Square and what happened there. Instead of clearing the square, he agreed to protester demands to kind of localize the ROC government and to usher in democracy. And he gave them a timeline. So that was 1990. He said in 2 years we'll have legislative elections, in 6 years we'll have presidential elections. And he won the first presidential election in 1996. But there were all these different forces at work that made this happen. So you can't really point to one thing. And for most of the time prior to that, during the ROC's time in Taiwan, the U.S. was definitely on the side of the KMT, and in terms of repressing Taiwanese identity and the desire for Taiwanese self-determination. And the U.S. was intervening on behalf of the KMT in presidential elections as recently as the first time that Taiwan ran against Ma Ying-jeou in when was that? That was 2008, or sorry,
16.
2012. So in 2011, an unnamed Obama official basically told the Financial Times that, look, if Taiwan elects Tsai Ing-wen, then that's going to probably have negative impact on the U.S.'s relations with China, and that was used to attack Tsai, in local media here in Taiwan afterwards, so it wasn't really, and now it doesn't, I would say, I don't see any indication that the U.S. is favoring either party, at least officially, but they seem to, messaging wise, they definitely have a lot more in common with the DPP than with the KMT.
So what do you think are the biggest internal threats to Taiwan's democracy today, right now? We have witnessed the Kuomintang's chairwoman's visit to mainland China, to Beijing. And what do you think of her visit?
Well, Zheng Liwen's visit, it got a lot of media attention, but I mean, it's really the steady visit of all different levels of KMT officials and members that are constantly going over to China. I mean, basically, after the re-election of the first DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, in 2005, or in 2004, it was in 2005 that the two top members of the blue camp, or kind of like the KMT aligned camp in Taiwan, they went over to China, and they kind of normalized party-to-party relations between the KMT and the CCP. And in the 2 decades following, then the former enemies, who fought a civil war and were facing off, almost went to war, and actually did have some fighting, during the Cold War, some hot fighting. Now they're increasingly close, both in terms of relations and in terms of messaging. And it's I've been here for 11 years, and just in that time, the two parties are noticeably much closer. And so, go ahead.
Are you worried that the KMT's closer ties with the Communist Party is part of the influence operation by Beijing, or they just part of the natural democratic different voice of opinions?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the KMT, and I wouldn't want to. But first of all, it's a big party, and there's a lot of different members with different agenda, and there's different factions. And Zheng Liwen, the current chair, she kind of came out of nowhere recently, and she surprised, I think, a lot of people in the KMT, especially the KMT establishment, and she's her visit to meet with Xi, I think, helped her consolidate party or power within the KMT itself, because she was less powerful before the trip. But it's really it's been going on this whole 20 years, and so like the Zheng Liwen, none of these meetings alone are really significant on their own, but it's actually the mass, it's the quantity, and so, I mean, whether or not I'm worried, I'm a journalist here. I'm not an ROC national, but in terms of Taiwan's democracy, right now you have a coalition between the KMT and the Taiwan People's Party, who have basically they've been voting, in lockstep with the KMT. They haven't had a serious clash with the KMT over anything so far that I'm aware of, and they haven't even tried to go over to the DPP and say, hey, we could form a coalition with you if you if you want to offer us something better than what we have with the KMT. It seems like there's very much the TPP is very much a blue party at the moment, even though it has previously described itself as being neither green nor blue, green being the DPP color. But it's I mean, I think in terms of Taiwan civil society, I mean, you had the Bluebird protests, the Qingniao protests a couple of winters ago, and that was kind of the a bit of a reawakening of kind of the green side of Taiwanese civil society that had largely avoided the streets. They during the 8 years of Taiwan, usually when they came out, it was either in support of Hong Kong or in support of same-sex marriage. But now it's looking like things are. You've got this deadlock with the coalition, the KMT TPP coalition, blocking the budget, blocking the special military budget, and doing farcical things like trying to, talking about passing a referendum, which they don't need a referendum. They have a majority, so they could actually just pass this. But on introducing caning as punishment for certain crimes, they're going to impeach Lai, or they're going to try to impeach President Lai, but they don't have the votes sufficient for that. And I doubt that anybody from Lai's party, the DPP, is going to join them in this. And so it's very much, in terms of Taiwan's image outside of its borders, it's looking, I think, a lot messier than before. And there's a lot of countries are questioning, like what kind of Taiwan are we going to be dealing with in the future? And so you look at the upcoming elections. There's local elections in November that might give some sort. Historically, they're not really tied to cross-strait relations. They're more just local politics. But in terms of the January 2028 election, that will very much shape the next 4 years of Taiwan's future. And if the DPP wins, it's going to be at least from the executive branch side of things, similar to what we've seen so far over the last decade plus. If the KMT returns to power, I think you're going to see aggressive moves to bring Taiwan closer to China, and I think there will be a very large response in the streets by Taiwanese people who consider themselves politically, distinct from China, and they want to keep, their democracy and the human rights that they have here that a lot of Chinese people don't have in China, and I think. This is historically, the Taiwanese people, when they're not happy with how they're being governed, they go to the streets, and they did it under the Qing, they did it under Japan, they've done it, they did it under the ROC, both pre and post democracy, and I don't see why that would ever stop being the case.
Well, with the detente between KMT and the Communist Party, doesn't that undermine the point number 4 we discussed before about unfinished civil war? If the nationalist is at peace with the communists already, there's no point about this unfinished civil war business, is it?
Well, but the nationalists are not in power in the executive branch.
Yeah, but the DPP is not part of the civil war. They were the new party formed in the 1980s. So.
Right, which also, they weren't allowed to form a party any earlier than that. And actually, they formed their party 1 year before it would have been legal to organize an opposition party. But during the martial law era, the ROC was not like the democracy, the free democracy that you have today. It was a military dictatorship, and it was a rump state. This was like, it was not a normal country by any means. I mean, it was sovereign and independent, but in a very abnormal and unpleasant way for most of the people here, whether they were Taiwanese or Chinese. But in terms of this falling, somehow this falling under the Civil War, I mean, it's great that the KMT and the CCP get along better, but the KMT is no longer the government of Taiwan. The KMT it's a minority party. It's an opposition party. And it's a Chinese opposition party, and they're making that very clear, especially recently, that if they're going to be reelected, that it would be, there would be a move much more in a Chinese direction. So if Taiwanese people see that and they decide that that's what they want, then that's what they'll get, and that's what they're entitled to. But if you look at polls, and these are polls by National Zhengzhou Daxue, National Zhengzhou University, which used to be the party school of the KMT. It was founded in China. This is not like a DPP establishment. They've been doing polls ever since 1992, both of interest in unification with China, with the PRC, as well as Taiwanese identity. And you've got 3% of Taiwanese people right now who consider themselves exclusively and only Chinese. And then you also have 3% who are like, in favor of unification with the PRC as things are right now. The vast majority of Taiwanese people, whether or not they think of themselves as part Chinese and Taiwanese, or all Taiwanese, whatever, they like what they have. They have per capita, they've got higher standards of living. I mean, a lot of people like to compare Taiwan to Shenzhen and Shanghai, but you can also compare it to other parts of the country. And most of China is not Shanghai or Shenzhen or Beijing. It's and it's in terms of per capita GDP, Taiwan's much better off. If you look at like just basic guaranteed rights, Taiwan's much better off. People are more than it's more than legal to criticize the government here, and people like to do that. People like to do it in China too, but they have to be really careful about doing it and internalize it. And Taiwan had that under martial law, under Chinese martial law, under the KMT, and they don't want that again. So I mean, if Taiwanese people matter, if their existence is worth anything, then most of these points that Ambassador Xiao brings up they're all irrelevant.
So you describe Taiwan as the fulcrum of global power balance. So what happens to the world if Taiwan fails, if got taken over by Beijing?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how that happens. If Taiwan willingly becomes part of the PRC and there's no war, that's one thing. If there's some sort of military attack or invasion by China, that's going to produce other outcomes. Most likely some sort of military conflict with the U.S. and probably Japan and the Philippines too, just due to geographic proximity of Japanese and Filipino islands to Taiwan. So without speculating too much on how that might look, if you just once the dust settles, you've got the PRC controlling Taiwan. I mean, it would seem if you look at the South China Sea, the militarization of those uninhabited islands, I would assume that they would also heavily militarize the inhabited island of Taiwan, and that would put it on the doorstep of both Japan and the Philippines. And if Taiwan were to become PRC, it would presumably be against Washington's wishes. So if Washington's lack of response or response, regardless of what happens, if China takes Taiwan, then you have a very serious discrediting of U.S. resolve and its relevance to the region. And so most countries are probably either going to think of something they could do on their own. So, for example, Japan could consider, developing nuclear weapons.
And South Korea.
South Korea as well, yeah. But or there might be, depending on who's in power, there might be some move to make like an accommodation with Beijing on kind of a new security order for the region. But as Bloomberg Economics, I think year and a half ago, their estimate was if there was an attempt, regardless of if it was successful or not, but if China attacked Taiwan, you would have basically $10 trillion, a tenth of global GDP would just evaporate. And this isn't just about chips. This is also about global trade, and then also just so many knock-on factors, going from there. It would be a cascade. It would be a cascade event, and basically everyone who's taken a serious look at it has concluded it would be much, much worse than the damage wreaked on the global economy and lives around the world by the COVID pandemic. So it's and it would also affect China as well. The Chinese Communist Party has historically shown itself, willing to for its people to endure suffering, as the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and other events have shown. The most recent example would be Tiananmen, the Tiananmen protests and the suppression of those. But it's really hard to say. I mean, if you're going to make, we don't really know how Xi Jinping thinks. He comes across as a pretty risk-averse person, but also, you don't get to a position that you're in. You don't get to that position by not taking the occasional risk, and sometimes maybe it's a big one. So yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to say what the world would look like, but it would be vastly different, and it would be awful for the people of Taiwan, because they would be getting treated like people in Tibet or Xinjiang or Hong Kong, where they're viewed with suspicion by the central government in Beijing. And there would, both Ambassador Xiao and the previous ambassador to France said, first comes liberation, then comes re-education. That doesn't bode well for the future of the Taiwanese people. But if like many people, you just don't care about the Taiwanese people and what they've fought for here, and you're just looking at the broader world in general, I just don't see it being a much better world for anybody. And even for the Communist Party of China, it might strengthen their hand, but I think at the cost of quite a bit of suffering for the average Chinese person.
So you mentioned there's many excellent books on Taiwan. Can you give us a recommendation apart from your excellent book, Ghost Nation? What other books would you recommend if people are interested in reading about modern Taiwan and its struggle?
I think Contested Taiwan by Lev Nachman, who's he's a doctor of political science at National Taiwan University. He's very well versed. A lot of what I know about electoral politics here and party formation and protest movements is from Lev's work and talks that he's given. Another good book would be, Revolutionary Taiwan by Catherine Zhou and Mark Harrison, which came out, I think, a little less than 2 years ago. I think Green Island is a great book. I think it's a bit older, but it really kind of captures the essence of how no one could trust anyone during the height of martial law in Taiwan. I think Shelley Rigger's books, they're very insightful, both in terms of just Taiwan's history and identity, but her more recent work has focused on Taiwan's unique and quite significant role in the economic development of China. See, what else do I have here? In terms of fiction, I think Wu Mingyi is a good author to read. I'm currently reading The Man with the Compound Eyes, which is a very interesting novel. And let's see, Yang Shuangzi. She recently the translation of her book Taiwan Travelogue recently won the National Book Award in the United States, and I have yet to get to that, but my understanding is it's a very interesting exploration of the nuance of identity, especially between Japanese in Taiwan and the Taiwanese who lived in kind of a separate space in society in Taiwan during the Japanese era.
Well, thank you for those recommendations. I'll put a link in the video descriptions to those books you mentioned. So, well, thanks very much, Chris, for your time. I think there are still a lot of topics we haven't covered. Maybe next time.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, Han. It was really a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Good night.